Hi and welcome to this new lecture on methods of data collection. Last week we spoke about the first method of data collection, which is interviews. And I hope you started to think about the relevance of these different methods to your topic, right? Because we're not speaking about theoretical topics that are unrelated to what you're working on, but to different methods that you can use in your own proposals this semester or in the future. So for instance, if you're working on women's rights in a certain country, you may start to think, well, can I actually include in my research design or in my research methods interviewing activists, women activists or gender activists in this country? Can I combine this with surveys to be distributed to samples of women to ask them about how they view the newly introduced rights? So you should start to think about how you can select one or more of these methods to use in your own proposals. So if we move now from interviews to focus groups, what do we mean by focus groups? Focus groups is actually we can classify it as a form of interview. So whereas in interviews we're actually doing one-to-one interview, we are interviewing individuals, and as we said last week, these individuals may be ordinary people or may be elites, intellectual elites or political elites. In focus groups we are actually interviewing groups. We are doing group interviews. We are interviewing groups of 6 to 10 people in a flexible and exploratory discussion format, i.e. we're bringing people who are experts who are relevant to the topic we're working on to discuss these topics, our research topics, and as we will see later, we depend on a certain set of questions, but then as in interviews there can be also flow of discussion beyond these set questions, right? And it's an interesting method that is not commonly used in political science research, but we can see that, well, it's being used more and more. So more recently, for instance, this week we had a colleague at the public administration department defending her doctoral thesis. She is working on education services in Egypt, especially primary education, and how this service, education, is perceived by those who are actually receiving this service, i.e. by the students, by parents, by the boards of parents in different schools. And in addition to distributing surveys to assess how students perceive education services, she also held focus group discussions with parents, with members of the boards of parents in different schools, اللي احنا بنسميهم مجالس الآباء, and also with teachers, right? So it's interesting here to bring, in addition to maybe interviewing some of these one-to-one, it's sometimes interesting also to bring all these people together, right? And hold a group discussion on the topic of interest. Yeah. And in addition to research and research projects, is also used as a tool or as a method in academic and policy circles. So you may hear every now and then that this research center, for instance, or this think tank is holding a closed roundtable discussion that is bringing together a few people to debate a certain issue. This is actually a focus group of some sort, right? So any meeting that is held with a number of experts in any field or in any topic to provide policy advice or to debate a certain topic is actually some sort of focus groups. But you may ask here, what is the role of the researcher if it is just a group of people that is discussing a certain topic? What is my role here? My role here, of course, will be first of all to prepare the question that I'm interested in, as we will see in our case or example toward the end of this lecture. And of course, during the discussion itself, to act as a moderator or a facilitator, right? And this is very important, because if, as we said last week, the quality of interviews will depend very much on your skill and on your preparation and so on and so forth. Here again, I mean, your skill as a moderator and as a facilitator in this discussion will define the quality of information you will get. Okay. As we said, I mean, here I'm interested not only in the viewpoint of certain individuals, but in the dynamics and interactions between these individuals, right? So again, using the example that I just mentioned, I'm not only interested in how parents, for instance, assess the educational services and see and define the challenges facing the educational process, but how they think of the views of the teachers, for instance, or the school board or whatever, how they interact with each other, how each group actually, each member perceives the views of the other member, right? So this interaction is also important. I'm not only interested in individual's point of view as in interviews, but also in how each group, how each member sees the viewpoint of the other, right? And again, here, similar to interviews, I'm not looking for truth or reality. I'm actually more interested in perceptions, right? In how group members perceive the topic of interest, as we will see, for instance, in the example toward the end of this lecture, how they define terrorism and counter-terrorism in the ways that can be used to challenge, terrorism and radicalism and so on and so forth, right? I'm not looking here about facts or figures or information necessarily, but I'm interested in how the group actually perceive all these topics and issues. And as you can guess, the strength of this method is that it allows the researcher to access what we call group norms, right? The values, as we said, the perceptions, the views of the group, and how it is formed, right? How it is created, how each member of the group can affect actually the views of the other, right? The idea of group thinking, how certain groups actually think. And it also allows the researcher to notice how, as we said, I mean, the dynamics of interactions between different members of the group, how each view adopted by a certain member, I mean, in our first example, the teacher or a school board or whatever, is perceived by the other side, is perceived by students, or is perceived by parents, or is perceived by other actors in this process. So these dynamics will only be discovered or uncovered if we held this kind of open discussion, right? Which is even as we know in our as we practice in our ordinary discussions. If we in our lecture, for instance, open discussions in a certain topic, so it's not only that we get the viewpoints of some students, but we also see how students actually can change their perceptions, right, as a result of this debate, right? So again, I mean, when we speak about individual interviews, it's very different than when we open a certain topic for discussion and see how ideas actually evolve as a result of this discussion. But of course, there are challenges. As in interviews, we have a problem in the representation of the sample. So as in interviews, I can start with a certain sample, with aiming at certain people, but then not all of them will actually cooperate, right? Not all of them will turn out. So you may be in a position where Some people will commit themselves to attending your focus group, but they do not actually turn out. And we'll see in a minute how can we deal with that. Right? Also, compared to interviews, people may be more conservative. So if you interview people individually, they may be more open to express their point of view, especially in a sensitive issue. But if you allow people to speak in public, in the presence of others, so this may, lead them to be more conservative, right? And to hide certain attitudes or views because they may not be actually socially correct, or they may be seen negatively by others, right? Again, we will see in a minute what are the tactics that can be used in order to avoid or overcome, at least part of these challenges. Again, as in interviews and even as in surveys that we will discuss in a couple of weeks, consistency and reliability is an issue, right? So again, the issue of people hiding their views or not being consistent, so saying something and then at the beginning and then towards the end or in the middle of the discussion they will actually say a contradictory statement, and here again it's the researcher's responsibility then to see if this was a change in mind as a result of the flow of discussions, or is it that this certain group member is actually inconsistent, or is actually not having an accurate or not about the accuracy, but not having really a well elaborated viewpoint about this topic, right? So all these issues can be problematic, and as in other methods, one way of dealing with this challenge is actually to combine more than one method, right? So for instance, you can combine focus groups and interviews. So if you found in focus groups that, well, there is someone who is particularly interesting, right, who hold particularly interesting views, and that you need to speak more with him, so you can then hold a one-to-one interview with this particular person, right? Or of course you can combine this with other sources, secondary sources, documents from the institution that you're focusing on, or any other sources of data. But this combination, or what we call triangulation of data, diversification of data sources, will actually help very much in cross-checking your information and your data. How can we deal with these challenges and increase the validity and reliability of results? Well, as in interviews, this will depend very much on your skills. But there are basic rules that you should stick to in order to actually encourage people to be more open and more collaborative. Like interviews, you should start with introducing yourself, introducing your topic, what is the objective of your research, that is done only for research purposes, not for any other purposes, and set the rules like the confidentiality, that people will remain anonymous, the identity will not be disclosed if they wish, and so on and so forth. If your institution requires prior consent, i.e. that the people should actually see the content of your group discussion and comment on them, so you should assure people that this will be guaranteed. You should have general rules in your mind, like if you have 6-7 people and you have 1 hour, so this means that, for instance, each one will start with 5 minutes and then we will open it for discussion, and so on and so forth, right? So there are rules that can increase the quality of information that you will get from focus groups. The researcher also should manage the discussion in a way that allow all people to participate, because you may have certain people who are outspoken or who have many things to say, and they can dominate the discussion so that only a couple of people from a group of 10 people, for instance, will participate while others remain silent. And of course you do not want that to happen. So again, your skills here as a moderator of this discussion and again setting the rules and declaring these rules from the very beginning that, well, you will allow a certain time for each member of the group, will make this less challenging. And as we said, I mean, most of the time you do not use focus groups only in your research. So as I said, if you're working on women's rights, for instance, in a certain country, so you can have surveys, interviews with activists, but you can also have focus groups. So why not, for instance, bringing a number of activists together from different, for instance, ideological backgrounds. So you may have, gender activists or women activists who are actually Islamist, and others who are leftist, and a third group that is liberal. And it will be interesting to see how these different, activists from different backgrounds interact, right, on a specific topic or issue, right? But you cannot do this alone. So you can, as I said, at least start with secondary data about the topic, and then see if you're going to do a survey or interviews, and to cover this dynamics of interaction between different groups. You can have this discussion between, as we said, 6, 7, 8 people, to see how they actually differ, or how they agree or differ on a certain topic, right? But most of the time we do not use focus groups alone, and we combine them with other methods of data collection. Now let's move to be practical, and I think there is a value added, as I said last time, in seeing how this is being applied, how any method of data collection is being applied and is practiced by scholars who publish their research in high ranked journals. And it's not only about how they apply their method, but how they actually justify the use of method in relation to their topic, and how they detail all the methodological details and challenges and limitations of this method. Because as we said last time, there's nothing like a perfect method of data collection. It all depends on your topic, and each method has its own strength and limitation. That's why we always speak about both the strength and weakness of this method, and how then you could actually deal with these weaknesses, right? So here we have an example of a journal article published by Jarvis and Lester a few years ago in Politics, which is a highly ranked political science journal. And again, you may not be interested in the topic itself, which is how certain groups of British people see terrorism and counter-terrorism and so on and so forth. But you should focus on how they actually present their argument, how they justify, which is the first point. How did the authors, for instance, justify the choice of the method in relation to the topic, right? So you will see in the first few pages of this article that they said, well, there are many studies on terrorism. Some of them actually focus on state policies, how, states, especially in liberal democracies, design and implement certain strategies and policies to counter radicalization and terrorism. But there is another group of literature that is focusing on what's called bottom-up research on counterterrorism, i.e. how communities and how individuals see terrorism and counterterrorism. And then they situate themselves in the second group of literature, the bottom-up research on counterterrorism. And of course, how can you discover this perceptions of ordinary people towards terrorism and counterterrorism? I mean, logically speaking, in terms of methods, you can either, use surveys, and they actually reviewed literature that did that in the past, or you can have interviews or focus groups, which was their own method, right? So here they made a a well elaborated justification, right, for their selection of the method. They said, well, we want to transcend the perceptions of the state, right? We're not very much interested in state policies, which were covered in many other studies, but we're interested in the views of ordinary people, right? And that the methods used in past literature to discover that were focus groups, interviews, and surveys. But the past research or existing literature indicated or focused very much on the fact that people are not satisfied with government policies on counterterrorism. But they did not move further to say what then are the strategies that are proposed by these ordinary people to tackle or to counter terrorism. And that's what we're doing, right? So how we are contributing to literature by taking a step forward and answering the question, which is the basic research question: if you were in government, what would you do about counterterrorism? That's what makes the contribution and the own research different. And of course, then, we do not want to go into the details of the research, and you have the research paper. You can have it's a brief one anyway, so you can have a quick look at it. But they say, for instance, how their findings and their interest in people's perception is actually challenging the idea of public apathy, that there is a widely held view that people are not interested in politics in general or in issues of, public debate, right? But their findings actually indicate that if you go to people and make your objective hearing from them what they think about government policies in counterterrorism and how it can be improved, they actually show a great interest in such an important topic, right? And it's also supporting the idea that even security issues that are quite sensitive can be open for discussion and debate in democratic settings, right? So this is a kind of a normative idea that since they are for democracy, since they support democracy and democratic decision making, they're making the point that, well, it is relevant, it is important to hear people's view, even in a topic that needs expertise and need interest, like the issue of counterterrorism. Anyway, and so that's how the two authors in the first few pages tried to sell the idea of the research, and it's important for you at this early stage to see how this is practiced. It's not only the idea that that you're having a fascinating research topic, but how you can actually sell it, how you can increase the interest of the reader in your research, how you can say that you're doing something different, okay? And then in the methodological section, and I try to select, article that an article that has a clear methodological section, so that you can see again how scholars justify and detail their use of method, right? Because again, you should not, start with your research question and then briefly speak about your method and then jump to conclusions, and then the reader would not actually be sure if he can depend on your findings or not. So to make the reader, more engaged and more aware of how you reach these conclusions or these findings, you should be clear about your method and the reliability and the validity of your results, and how you try to increase these validity and reliability. So you will see in this article, for instance, that the two scholars are saying how they selected their sample. So they said, well, that this is the purpose of sample, and of course then it's a non-random sample, and thus we cannot actually generalize. But so here we're speaking about the perceptions of particular people, of some groups. We cannot actually generalize, but it's still a good start, and provides interesting insights into how people think about all these issues. and how they even stratified these samples. And of course, the stratification has also a logic, right? So they said we're interested in stratifying this sample according to the region, right, or the geographical residence, metropolitan, non-metropolitan. And why did they select that? Because they assume, again, based on literature, that where the person lives, right, if he's living in London or Birmingham, which are metropolitan areas with different with diverse groups, will be very different from people working in or living in other non-metropolitan areas like Oldham or Oxfordshire or whatever, right? And then they stratified it also according to the ethnic background, if they're black, white, or Asian. And again, this is based on literature that, ethnicity, the ethnic background of any person will actually affect his own view on how he perceives issues of identity, multiculturalism, and thus issues of terrorism and counterterrorism and radicalization and so on and so forth. And then something that they did not mention explicitly, but is implicit in the finding that they provided, gender, right? Because when they refer to the views of different people, they then refer to the city, and then or the location or the region, and then to the ethnic background, and then to the gender, which also factor in many views, in many political views. So there's again this kind of assumption that there may be a difference between males and females in different topics, in voting behavior, in views on terrorism, on identity, and so on and so forth. And that's why they also stratified it according to the gender, and tried to make gender balance in the focused groups. And then they spoke also about the size of groups. So they said, well, we had 14 focus groups in these different regions, and we had 81 participants, which means that, well, each group had something like 6 or 7 members, right? And then they spoke also about the location and the timing of holding these focus groups, right? So that they held it in these cities, in London, in Birmingham, and Oldham, and so on and so forth, and that this was done in 2010. So all these information should be clearly stated. What type of questions? Yeah. So they said that they depended on open-ended 5 questions plus follow-ups, right? Open-ended means that there are no choices. So they will actually say the questions, and they even listed the questions. So questions like, for instance, what kinds of security threats do people in this country face? And then they will leave, the persons to speak openly. They do not have choices like, severe security threats, limited security threats, and then people will select from. And in focus groups, this is often the case. Right, so you do not give choices. You only give choices in questionnaires or surveys, because this will be even easier in coding, and you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of participants in surveys. So you need the simplicity in coding and in choices and giving specific choices and so on and so forth. But in ordinary interviews, or interviews with ordinary people, and with elites, as we said last time, and here in focus groups, you often have this open-ended questions, right? So you have specific questions, and that's why we call it semi-structured interviews, which are listed here in the research. So they listed about 5 basic questions, and then a few questions that can be used as follow-ups. But you then have these questions as open-ended, i.e. you leave the space to your group members in focus groups or in interviews, to the interviewees, to express themselves freely, right? And then they finally spoke also about the limitations. Yeah, what were the challenges, right? So they mentioned 2 things here, right? That they claim no representation. As we said, they depended on a purpose of sample, and thus whatever results they found or actually not can actually not be generalized, right? And then they said also, which is a general feature of focus groups, as we said before, that they are interested in the beliefs and opinions of participants. They are not interested in facts or reality or whatever, right? So here they're also making clear what are the limitations. So they're not looking for certain figures or specific information that is missing in other sources, but they're interested in perceptions, and they make no claim of representing all the views of all British people. But they also ended with how they actually deal with the results or the responses. So now that they have the responses of all group members in all these 14 groups, what did they do? And you can see here again that what we said in analyzing also interview results is used here. So they said that they use something called framework qualitative discourse analysis, and there is nothing complicated here, because what they did was simply to read all the results and then try to divide them thematically, as we said in analyzing qualitative analysis of interviews. So they read all the answers and then they said, well, we can classify them into 3 major themes: problems of counterterrorism, causes of terrorism, and then approaches to counterterrorism. And then we can divide these themes into sub-themes, again according to answers. So this is all a kind of qualitative analysis by dividing the findings and the results into themes. Finally, how they present the findings in the different aspects of the paper and the different themes and divisions and parts of the paper. So you will see, for instance, again, details here are not important. We're not interested in the subject or the topic itself, but we're interested in, again, the methodological aspects. So you will find, first of all, that they use the participants' words. So they tried very much not to express the people in their own ways, in the author's own ways, but to use the words used by the participant themselves, like saying, well, that terrorism and fighting terrorism is a massive question, for instance, quoting one participant, right? So using the participants' words is very important, and it's important not only in focus groups but also in interviews, and even, as we will see later on when we speak about observation, using the words, since we are interested in people's perception, so we should use people's words, yeah, and quotations from what the people said. And then keeping the participants anonymous, right? So you will see no reference to any names, right? Although the topic is not that sensitive, right? I mean, it's not really highly critical, for instance, of government policies or what have you. But since people will feel more secure if you assure them that the identity will not be disclosed, so most of us doing interviews or focus groups will actually follow this rule of hiding the identity of people. So you will find them referring to people's views and then only saying place and ethnicity and gender, like London, white, female, for instance. Yeah. And here the idea is to try later on to present different trends. So to say, for instance, that most London-based members suggested that this and that X, Y is the most effective way of counterterrorism, right? And that's again the way that in which you analyzed results of focus groups or even interviews, as we said last time. Right? So you will find things like, for instance, a number of people were confident in the knowledge of terrorism and its solutions, while others were less certain. So while actually trying to analyze the results qualitatively, as we said, you should be looking at trends, what most of the people thought and what others, on the other hand, argued. Right? Other examples, for instance, that several participants pointed out the importance of dialogue to find solutions. Right? What most of the people said. Most participants said that prison is not the answer to radicalization, but there was also another less common view that supported using more force, like the deportation of radical elements, for instance, right? So you need to be aware not only of what people said, but what was the common and the less common point of view, right? To make this kind of comparisons, right? And since, as we said, we were speaking about focus groups, so these dynamics are even more important. What most of the people said, what only a few of people argued, and so on. And then, of course, to relate that to the different classification, stratification that he put at the beginning, like saying, as we said, that most Londoners, for instance, or London-based groups suggested this or that, right? While those living in this region suggested other means, right? Or that, for instance, most females, were suggested more peaceful means of tackling radicalization, while most men or most whites or most, held this other view, right? So again, I mean, it's interesting to look at how, when you present your findings, you do all this analytics. So that's all for focus groups. As I said, it's very important for you to think, even if you're not required to apply these methods this semester, to think of the relevance to your topic, right? So each of you in the 11 or 12 proposals that you're working on should start thinking whether this method will be relevant to your topic or not. And in doing this, you can have a quick look at the few pages in Halbrand and Heath book. As I said, it's only a few pages on how you can conduct focus groups. So that's already available on Moodle, so you can consult it and let me know if you have any questions. And just as an example, the example that we've just mentioned of Jarvis and Lester on counterterrorism, and again, that's already available on Moodle. For last week, the interviews, I mean, there will not be, as agreed, there will not be specific assignments or for this week. Next week, we will start the comments on your proposal. So by next week, I'll be hopefully done with reading the proposals that you sent by email, and then we can have a lecture on the major common maybe mistakes in your proposals, but also the things that I found that you made progress on, and then you will get your the comments for each proposal or for each group, and we can see how then we can handle any questions that you may raise. But as I said, you should start from now thinking about the method that you will be using, because this will be part of your final submission. So in the final submission, you will not only have a proposal, but a detailed design for a certain method that you will use. So if you're using interviews, for instance, elite interviews, you will be required to present an interview protocol similar to what we did last week. If you're going to hold focus groups with activists of women's rights, for instance, so again, you will be required to present a protocol or a few pages on this focus groups, what will be your target group members, what are the questions that you will be asking them, and so on. And if you will be doing a survey, as we'll discuss in a couple of weeks, again, how you're gonna select the sample, what are the questions, so you will be asked to design a questionnaire for the survey, and to think of the size and the features of your sample. So that's why it's important as early as possible to think about these methods, even if you're not going to apply them and to have a full research. It's very important for you to have a clear idea about the method that you will apply in case you conducted this research. Again, if you have any question, you can let me know, and yeah, stay safe and have a good weekend. Thank you.